This countdown presented the 9 most devastating factory deaths ever recorded. They were real incidents in which experienced workers lost their lives to machinery failures and ignored safety warnings. From overlooked routine hazards to catastrophic system breakdowns, each case triggered sweeping changes in workplace regulations. Some involved lethal shortcuts, and others involved split-second equipment malfunctions that no amount of training could prevent. Which workplace tragedy stood as the most haunting lesson of all? The countdown began with number 9. Daniel Reyes arrived early for his shift at the Springfield, Illinois food processing plant on April 12, 2019. Known as Dan to his co-workers, he had spent 14 years maintaining the same conveyor system, often working extra hours to support his 2 children. He was assigned routine maintenance on a production line that had been flagged 3 weeks earlier. That inspection had documented an exposed roller missing its guard, and the report remained unresolved as production deadlines took priority. That morning, Dan reached across the moving belt and his shirt sleeves snagged on the rotating roller. In seconds, his arm was pulled into the machine. He reached for the emergency stop, but the button failed because the electrical contacts were corroded. The conveyor's compression force pinned his torso, causing crush injuries to his ribs and lungs. Coworkers cut power at the main disconnect, but by the time paramedics arrived 7 minutes after the 911 call, Dan was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead 11 minutes after the call was placed. OSHA cited the facility for lockout and tagout violations under citation number 2019145 and issued a $147,000 fine. Dan's family received a $1.2 million wrongful death settlement. The case triggered a nationwide amendment to 29 CFR 1910.147, mandating strict enforcement of lockout and tagout protocols in all U.S. factories. Jacob Mills was 28 years old, recently engaged, and had just been promoted to quality control inspector at an auto parts plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. On August 19, 2020, he was assigned to inspect a finished component inside the Omnivex H3000 hydraulic press. The press cycled every 8 seconds, a rhythm Jacob knew well. That day, the 2-hand control system, meant to keep both of his hands safely outside the chamber, had been jumper wired to speed up inspections. A faulty PS42 pressure sensor falsely signaled the press was clear, even as Jacob leaned in. The chamber closed without warning. The descending ram crushed his head and torso, causing catastrophic trauma. Coworkers hit the emergency stop within 2 seconds, but the force of the hydraulic system made rescue impossible. Jacob was pronounced dead at the scene. The press lacked a light curtain, a safety feature that would have prevented activation with a person inside. District attorneys filed reckless homicide charges against plant management. The press manufacturer issued Recall 20042 for all affected models. A NSIB 11.2 was updated, making light curtains mandatory across the industry. Jacob's death forced a nationwide reckoning with the dangers of bypassed safeguards and single sensor reliance. Olivia Chen arrived at her Albany metal shop before sunrise, as she had for 15 years. At 42, she was a mentor machinist, respected for her precision and the way she guided new hires through the hazards of rotating equipment. The company handbook required hair restraints, but enforcement had faded into routine. On February 11, 2021, Olivia prepared a custom order on a Harrison CL1440 lathe, setting the spindle to 1,200 revolutions per minute. A single lapse, her ponytail left unbound, proved fatal. As she leaned in to measure a cut, her hair caught in the spinning chuck. The torque at that speed tore her scalp away and slammed her head against the steel bed, fracturing her skull. The emergency stop was mounted 6 feet from her station, out of reach in those seconds. Co-workers dialed 911 as soon as they heard the impact. Paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, but Olivia died from head trauma and hemorrhage within 4 minutes of the incident. Investigators found written policies for hair restraints, but no audits and no discipline for violations. The owner pled guilty to willful OSHA violation and served 6 months in jail. New York's Industrial Code Rule 121 was amended, mandating enforced personal protective equipment policies and reachable emergency stops at every workstation. Marcos Alvarez was 23 years old, single, and new to the overnight sanitation crew at a chemical processing plant in Portland, Oregon. On October 7, 2021, he was assigned to clean the interior of an 8,000-gallon Chempro MX 8000 industrial mixer. The vessel, a towering steel tank lined with chemical residue, required entry for deep cleaning. Protocol demanded a confined space permit and a trained attendant at the hatch, but neither was in place. Marcos entered the tank alone. The plant's wireless control system used Bluetooth signals to operate equipment throughout the facility. That night, a signal overlap from a nearby workstation remotely activated the mixer's internal agitator blades. Marcos was still inside. The blades started without warning, striking him and knocking him unconscious. He slipped beneath the chemical solution, suffering blunt force trauma and chemical burns. There was no one posted at the entry, no one to notice his absence. 45 minutes passed before a co-worker realized Marcos was missing. By the time rescue teams arrived, he had drowned. The OSHA fatality inspection, case number 202022178, documented the absence of a confined space permit, the lack of an attendant, and the wireless interference that triggered the remote start. The plant received the maximum penalty, $250,000, and the incident led to a revision of NFPA 350, requiring wireless lockouts and strict confined space entry procedures nationwide. Marcos's death forced an industry reckoning with the unseen dangers of remote activation in enclosed spaces. Aaron Patel was 34 years old, married, and the chair of the safety committee at a Tucson electronics plant. On March 29, 2022, he began his shift overseeing a Fantrix R15 robotic assembly cell, a system he had helped install and routinely audited for hazards. The day's task was a servo replacement, which required the protective cage to be removed. With the cage off, the cell's motion sensors should have disabled the robot's movement, but a software update, firmware version 4.8, had corrupted the safety layer. The update, pushed overnight to improve cycle times, left the proximity sensors offline. No rollback procedure was in place, and the physical barriers were still down from maintenance. Aaron stepped in to check the robot's alignment. The arm, reading no obstacle, suddenly accelerated. It pinned his chest to the steel frame, compressing his lungs. He struggled for air as the robot's servos held him in place. The plant's control room had no live alert. His team found him 12 minutes later. He died from asphyxiation within 6 minutes of entrapment. The investigation traced the failure to a single line of code that bypassed the safety interlock. Recall 21-198 was issued for all Fantrix R15 units, and ISO 10218 was revised to require dual redundant proximity sensors on automated cells. The plant instituted strict cage removal protocols and software validation checks for every update. Aaron's death forced manufacturers and regulators to confront the risks of automation, proving that even the most advanced systems were only as safe as their last line of code. Linda Gomez was 48 years old, a mother of 3, and a fixture on the shop floor at Midwest Sheet Metal in Milwaukee. Over 22 years, she had trained dozens of new hires on the company's aging presses, always stressing the importance of safety. On June 15, 2022, Linda was mentoring a recent recruit, demonstrating the correct way to align sheet metal in the Coltec 200-ton stamping press. 3 weeks earlier, the press's point of operation guard had been removed for repair and never reinstalled. The work order for a replacement sat unsigned as production quotas mounted. The press relied on a foot pedal to cycle, a model known for its hypersensitivity. The worn pedal on Linda's machine could trigger with as little as 1.2 ounces of pressure, barely the weight of a pencil. That morning, as Linda reached into the die to show the trainee proper hand placement, her foot brushed the pedal. The press cycled instantly. Both of Linda's hands were caught between the steel dies, severed above the wrists by a force exceeding 80,000 pounds. She collapsed, bleeding heavily, as the trainee dialed 911. Paramedics arrived in 7 minutes, but Linda died from hemorrhagic shock within 14 minutes of the accident. Investigators found the missing guard, the defective pedal, and a pattern of ignored safety work orders. OSHA issued a willful violation, citation number 2021-0041. The shop owner was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Wisconsin Administrative Code SPS 332 was amended, mandating 2 hand control systems for all presses statewide. The facility closed permanently. Linda's death forced manufacturers to confront the consequences of removing safety devices to meet deadlines, and it set a precedent for criminal liability when profit was put ahead of worker protection. Henry Lawson spent nearly 3 decades at the Baltimore Materials Recovery Facility. He worked his way up from line operator to senior waste management technician. At 52, with retirement just 2 years away, he was known for his steady presence and encyclopedic knowledge of the plant's machinery. On the morning of September 16, 2022, Lawson was called to clear a jam in the Shredmaster SM6000, a massive industrial shredder used to process construction debris. The only access was from a steel catwalk, 15 feet above the machine's intake. The railing on RA11 had failed its load test in a safety inspection 6 months earlier. Corrosion was documented, but repairs were deferred. Lawson clipped his radio to his belt and leaned over to dislodge a jammed pallet. As he shifted his weight, the corroded railing gave way with a sharp crack. He fell, striking the shredder's edge before tumbling into the active cutting mechanism. The SM6000's rotating blades, designed to tear through steel and concrete, offered no resistance to flesh and bone. The emergency stop was triggered within seconds, but recovery teams faced a grisly task that lasted nearly 3 hours. Investigators found that the facility had failed to follow up on the documented corrosion, despite the ANSI Standard A1264.1 requiring timely remediation of structural hazards. OSHA fined the company $412,000 for willful safety violations, and prosecutors indicted senior management for negligent homicide. Lawson's death led to an immediate amendment of the ANSI Standard A1264.1, mandating strict timelines for repairing structural deficiencies and requiring fall protection harnesses for all elevated work. The case set a new legal precedent for corporate accountability, as the company faced both criminal charges and civil suits from Lawson's family. What began as a routine jam clear exposed the deadly cost of ignoring maintenance warnings, shifting the burden of liability from individual workers to corporate decision-makers. Victor Ramos started his shift at the Atlanta Precision Stamping Plant on February 9, 2023, just before dawn. At 37, he was a skilled tool and die maker, known for his attention to detail and steady hands. His twin daughters, born the previous fall, were the reason he took every overtime slot he could. That morning, Victor was assigned to adjust the die inside a Press Pro MX55 model, a machine he had serviced dozens of times. The press was set to single-stroke mode, designed to cycle once per foot pedal press with a CD22 clutch mechanism at its core. The CD22 had a documented history. Since 2015, OSHA's IMIS system logged 17 separate reports of unexpected double cycling on the same clutch design. Each incident involved the press completing its stroke, then, without warning, initiating a second cycle. The manufacturer received these reports but deemed a recall not economically justified. Instead, they issued internal bulletins and left presses in service, calculating that settlements would cost less than a full-scale recall or redesign. Victor finished his setup and pressed the foot pedal. The press descended, completed its stroke, and rose as expected. He reached in to adjust the die, trusting the single-stroke setting. In that instant, the clutch slipped. The machine cycled again without warning. Both of Victor's arms were caught between the die and the bolster, and were severed above the elbows. Blood loss was immediate and catastrophic, 2.1 liters in less than 8 minutes. Co-workers applied tourniquets and called 911, but paramedics pronounced Victor dead at the scene. He never regained consciousness. The investigation uncovered the manufacturer's prior knowledge and internal cost-benefit analyses. Federal prosecutors indicted company executives under Title 18, Section 1349, for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, citing deliberate concealment of the defect. Victor's family received $38 million in a civil settlement. A NSIB 11.1 Clause 8 was revised to require dual clutch interlocks and fail-safe mechanisms on all new presses. The case forced an industry reckoning. Safety could no longer be weighed against the bottom line when lives were at stake. Sarah Whitaker's day began at 5:30 a.m. in Des Moines, Iowa, as it had for the past 2 decades. At 46, she was the senior maintenance engineer at Hearth Foods, a commercial bakery known for high-volume production and tight schedules. Her teenage son depended on her steady paycheck, and co-workers described her as the backbone of the maintenance crew. On December 4, 2023, Sarah was called to troubleshoot a temperature sensor inside the ProBake XL90 industrial oven. The oven was in standby mode, with a cleaning cycle scheduled to run before the next shift. For 5 weeks, the internal emergency release latch had been broken, a fact noted in maintenance logs, but left unaddressed as parts orders were delayed and production quotas pressed on. Sarah entered the oven, bypassing the standard lockout procedure to avoid disrupting the morning bake. The oven's automatic door lock engaged as the cleaning cycle initiated, sealing her inside. Within 2 minutes, a coworker in the control room heard frantic pounding, but the external override failed to disengage the lock. The oven's temperature ramped up, reaching 500 degrees Fahrenheit in under 4 minutes. Trapped, Sarah's core body temperature soared past 109 degrees. Hyperthermia and smoke inhalation overwhelmed her in less than 6 minutes. Co-workers tried to force the door, but by the time firefighters arrived, she was already dead. Investigators found the broken emergency latch had been reported repeatedly, with no repair authorization issued. The ProBake XL90's design lacked a redundant egress system or a temperature-sensing interlock that would have halted the cycle if a person had been detected inside. State prosecutors charged Hearth Foods executives with criminally negligent homicide, case 2024 CR 118. OSHA fined the company $623,000 for willful violations. The oven's manufacturer released Bulletin SBO 45, mandating dual emergency exits and temperature-triggered lockouts on all future models. Sarah's death forced the industry to recognize that every shortcut, every ignored warning, and every design flaw carried a preventable human cost that could not be undone. Across all 9 tragedies, one pattern stood out. Every rule in industrial safety had been written in the aftermath of preventable loss. The most experienced workers did not fall to chance. They fell to broken systems and ignored warnings. Safer factories existed because someone did not come home. Industrial progress was not measured only in output, it was counted in lives saved. Every regulation stood as an unspoken memorial.